it water with the sheep in the box?
Hello everyone, this is the second time I'm recording this, because I forgot to select the right fucking microphone. I'm a dickhead. Anyway, fuck it, here we are. So, as you may be aware, it is Pride Month at the moment, and that does very much include trans people, unlike J.K. Rowling's feminism. Now, you may be aware that I did make 2 videos about Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling already, one of which is 1.5 hours long and is a complete breakdown of all the troubling politics that in retrospect I found in Harry Potter. The other one is a 15-minute follow-up to that video when J.K. Rowling got involved in trans stuff. This video is completely unscripted, which is annoying because I think I said some quite insightful things the first time around. But fuck it, I've got nothing better to do. I'm sitting in my armchair. I've just watched a really fucking depressing documentary about Jeffrey Epstein. I had a Twix for breakfast. Let's fucking go.
What a fucking liar, dude. What a fucking Weasley little liar, dude. What a fucking Weasley little liar, dude. Holy shit, dude. Holy fucking shit, dude. Literally lying. Still lying to his audience. Can someone at least fucking enlighten Destiny that he's literally lying to his audience? What a fucking piece of shit, dude.
So, I wasn't going to make this video because, quite frankly, fuck J.K. Rowling, but also, I've talked a lot about her, and I talked a lot about her tweets previously, and this is just more of the same. I didn't really want to make a whole thing about it, but oh, fuck me. She couldn't just take the L. She couldn't just be like, yeah, I fucked up, or even just do a Graham Linehan and just double down and just continue to be a shithead on Twitter. No, see, she had to try and defend herself. So she wrote a blog post, and that's what we're going to be talking about today because, oh boy, it's fucking bad. It's really, really fucking bad. Without further ado, I guess, balls to it, let's jump in. I've already done like half of this already, so I guess at least I know what to say this time around. So first of all, the title, J.K. Rowling writes about her reasons for speaking out on sex and gender issues, is a bit of a misnomer because this whole essay could just be summed up with, I'm a bigot and I hate trans people, but, you know, fuck it, whatever. She opens up by crying about toxicity and how she worries about civility and that she doesn't want to add to the toxicity, which is interesting because that's all she's fucking done so far. So then there's a whole thing about Maya Forstater. I'm not going to go over the Maya Forstater thing again. I did make a whole video about it when it happened and when J.K. Rowling did originally come out and support her whilst bashing trans people. She misframes it. It's wrong. What she says about it is just factually incorrect. Maya Forstater did not try and argue that a philosophical belief that sex is determined by biology is protected in law. What she tried to argue was that misgendering is protected speech, which it isn't. Furthermore, she was not fired. She didn't lose her job. She was on a rolling contract, decided to be transphobic whilst on that rolling contract, and the company decided not to renew her contract anymore. She was not a victim here. The people she abused were victims here. Next up, J.K. Rowling tries to appeal to authority here, claiming that she's read up a lot on trans issues and that she's spoken to gender specialists, etc, etc. The interesting part is that she mentions intersex people, which is very confusing to me because presumably she is then aware that her gender essentialist binary way of thinking doesn't even apply to sex, never mind gender, but apparently it just didn't cross her mind. Furthermore, if this was true, if she had read up on all the scientific literature, she then has no excuse for the rest of the article, because if she'd actually read up on the credible science behind gender dysphoria, gender transition, just trans people in general, she wouldn't have the opinions that she does because the scientific and sociological consensus is that gender is a social construct, trans people are valid, and that one does not need to physically transition to be trans. She then says that she's interested in it because of a book that she's writing, which I really honestly hope that she doesn't try and write a trans character because she's tried that once before and it didn't fucking work out very well. Then she whines about how people were upset with her because she liked a transphobic tweet by accident or something, which, yeah, if you're a public figure and you like something pretty yikes, people are going to say, hey, that's pretty yikes. She said it was an accident, whatever. I would say that it's pretty clear that it's not, though, to be honest, considering everything that's come out since then. Let's move on. She likes using the right-wing idea of saying that any disagreement is evidence of wrongthink, when all it is mild disagreement. And quite frankly, she's also guilty of this. Because people who say, for example, trans people are valid, maybe we should respect trans men, maybe instead of saying women when we talk about menstruation, we should say people who menstruate, because that's more inclusive and it helps trans men, and I think it's a good idea. She thinks that that's wrong. She tells those people to shut the fuck up, basically. Is that evidence of wrongthink? And again, a persistent low level of harassment. What her normalizing of this rhetoric, her supporting people who regularly abuse trans people, that's what causes harassment. harassment. But she just doesn't seem to understand. She doesn't seem to really grasp what's going on. Like, does she honestly think that transphobes receive more hate online than trans people? See, this whole argument is essentially the same thing that Count Dankula likes to argue when people say that his rhetoric enables racism more or Nazis or whatever. He says, oh, what, you think I personally cause someone to go and be racist? No, probably not, but your rhetoric and your normalization of these kinds of ideas and this kind of rhetoric does contribute to an environment in which more harassment is going to happen because it becomes more mainstream and more acceptable. Then she writes this, and quite frankly, it's very generous to Magdalene Burns, who was a virulent and really quite nasty transphobe who said things like this about trans people, and yeah, fucking yikes. And also, if that's the sort of person that you describe as an immensely brave young feminist and lesbian who was a great believer in the importance of biological sex and didn't believe lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises, without acknowledging any of the other shit, we have to question why you would do that. Further, I actually don't know anyone who says that lesbians should be called bigots for not dating trans women with penises. The one person I see constantly cited as apparently having said this is Riley Dennis, and she didn't even say that. Furthermore, we don't think that biological sex doesn't exist, or that it's not important. We just think that it's different from gender. Then she cries about the backlash, and yeah, people, maybe don't be shitty to people online, but I would also direct that criticism to J.K. Rowling herself for normalizing hateful rhetoric. She tries to argue that they say I was literally killing trans people with my hate, but I didn't do that, and I'm going to make a comparison that I know she'd really fucking hate, so I'm quite happy with that. Boris Johnson made some incredibly offensive Islamophobic comments a few months ago. In the wake of those comments, hate crimes against Muslims rose by 375%. Now, we could argue over whether or not it would be fair to accuse Boris Johnson of literally causing those hate crimes. However, it would be ridiculous to claim that his rhetoric and his normalizing of this behavior and these ideas didn't contribute, didn't embolden, and didn't enable people to go out and do these things. Likewise, someone like J.K. Rowling, who's beloved, who is a national icon, a national treasure in some circles in the UK, coming out and saying, essentially, it's okay to hate trans people, will embolden a lot of people and will cause a lot of harassment and a lot of abuse, some of which will literally lead to suicides or murders. So yes, whilst it may not necessarily be 100% accurate to say that she literally murdered trans people with her hate, it's honestly not far off, and it's semantic at this point. Then she goes off on one about how lots of people really supported her, but it's interesting because she claims that they work in fields dealing with gender dysphoria and trans people, but that could refer to a lot of people. Like, I work in insurance, and I sometimes deal with trans people over the phone with their insurance claims, and you know what? Technically, I work in a field dealing with trans people, but I'm not an expert, and I can tell you now, my co-workers definitely aren't. And then we get the classic transphobic bit, which is to say that they're deeply concerned about the way a socio-political concept, that being apparently trans people are valid, is influencing politics, medical practice, and safeguarding. She doesn't say what these concerns are specifically, but for TERFs it's enough to just say, we women have concerns. We need to talk about it. And look, I'm not going to redo the whole bit from Sean's video, go and watch it, but this is a very well-known tactic, and it doesn't mean anything. Then she goes on and hides behind marginalised groups as a way to bash trans people, implying that in some way trans rights affects young people, gay people, and women, which isn't true at all. For one thing, trans people can be young, gay, and women, so I don't see what the fucking point is here. But even if she does think that trans men aren't men and trans women aren't women, some trans people are women within that paradigm. And then she goes on about a climate of fear, which is very familiar, or should seem very familiar, to anyone who's had arguments on the internet about Me Too, because this is the exact rhetoric that rich, powerful men liked to use at the time when they said things like, oh, so that just means that I can't interact with any women anymore then. When no, you can, just don't harass them, don't be sexist, don't abuse them, don't invalidate them, don't objectify them. Just be a decent human being. And J.K. Rowling is now making the argument that there's a climate of fear now. We can't be around trans people. We can't talk about trans issues. Yes, you can. Just don't be a dick. Just don't invalidate them. Don't treat them like shit, you're really apparently keen to do. Then she cries a bit more about people criticising her for her transphobic rhetoric, saying, oh, I only wanted to share a free children's book, but activists just came back and attacked me for no reason. apparently it had nothing to do with the transphobic tweets that you made implying that trans men aren't men, that trans women aren't women, that the only thing that defines a woman is whether or not they menstruate, which apparently means that old women aren't women. My grandma isn't a woman now, apparently. People have had cancer and had a hysterectomy. They're not women anymore. It was an incredibly dumb, stupid thing to say. She didn't apologise, she doubled down, and now she's claiming that actually it was just completely out of the blue that people were attacking her, rather than, continued transphobic rhetoric. Then we get into the TERF discourse. She gets it wrong, obviously. She says that TERF is an acronym coined by trans activists, which isn't true. TERF is an acronym that's coined by TERFs for themselves, but whatever, I guess just make shit up if it helps your argument. She does make a good point though, in that far too often we do actually call people TERFs when they're not even radical feminists, we just call transphobes TERFs. And yeah, we should stop doing that. TERF is a very specific term, it means a very specific thing, and I've seen people calling fucking Anne Widdecombe a TERF. Like, no. However, TERFs do exist, they are real, and trying to deny that is just absurd, really. So she gives 2 examples here. I'm not sure if they're real or not, or if they're hypothetical. I haven't heard of them, but let's go over them, I guess. So there's a mother of a gay child who is afraid their child wanted to transition to escape homophobic bullying. Again, yep, that's fine. Have that concern, but the thing is that gender clinics and gender activists don't have vested interest in forcing children to medically transition. The most they'll do is put them on puberty blockers, which has absolutely no adverse effects, until they're old enough to make a decision on their own. And if they decide that they're not trans, they take them off the puberty blockers and puberty hits them like a freight train, and they just continue as they were before. I don't know if this woman is a TERF. It's possible that she's not, in which case, yeah, sure. There's also the one about the old woman who says that she's not going to visit Marks and Spencer's because they're allowing people to enter the changing room. I don't know. Like, this point is particularly not really a good argument in my opinion. For a start, how are they policing it? Like, can trans women go into the women's changing room? Can trans men? Are they just going to check everyone's genitals before they go in? Are they going to ask for gender recognition certificates if you don't look cis enough? Furthermore, there's a lot of places that actually do have gender neutral or unisex changing rooms, because you know what? Most of the time, there's cubicles. Like, what do you think people are doing in there? Furthermore, I've been allowed into changing rooms with my partner at the time, and we were a cis couple. Like, in what world does that make sense? And here she says, any man who says they identify as a woman. It's a very, very, very transphobic point here, because basically she's arguing that trans women aren't women, because what other interpretation is there to have here? But yes, this person wasn't a radical feminist, shouldn't be called a TERF, just a transphobe. Then she makes the point that radical feminists aren't even trans exclusionary because they include trans men in their feminism. Oh, God. Okay, so, for a start, no, they don't. In my experience, TERFs view trans men as just mentally ill women and do everything they can to minimize them and attack them, just as they do trans women. Furthermore, they do think that trans men are essentially just women who want to escape the patriarchy, which is just frankly insane. Do you have any idea the amount and the level of harassment and abuse trans men get for transitioning? Do you honestly think that trans men have an easier lot of life than cis women? Are you taking the piss? Besides, this does sort of imply that in J.K. Rowling's mind, feminism is only for women, or for whatever female-bodied, whatever the fucking bullshit term that she wants to use is, when that's never been the case. Feminism is for everyone, it's about equality. Like, I don't want to rehash 2016 arguments here, but a lot of the points the MRA crowd used to make, like all the shit about like custody and mental health and suicide and all that, that's a feminist issue as well, because it's the toxic masculinity that the patriarchy instills into us that causes these kinds of issues. Like with mental health, for example, this toxic masculinity that comes from a society that tells us that men are supposed to be stoic and not ask for help ever. That's what causes this kind of shit. Now, this is interesting because now she's claiming that the real problem with accusations of TERFness is that it's intimidated people into not speaking out because they don't want to be called transphobic. Like, okay, like what are you saying that people would call transphobic? Because if it's transphobic, maybe just don't say it. Like, I actually don't see what... She doesn't give any examples here. There's nothing that I could latch onto and say, oh, well, this is wrong because XYZ, or, oh, yes, actually, no, you've got a good point there, because she doesn't fucking say anything. She just says, people who are cowering before the tactics of the playground, they'll call us transphobic, they'll say I hate trans people. Why would they say that? What is it that you're saying that might make people say that? Give an example, and I can either argue against it or agree with you. I'm not unreasonable, I just want an example. What next? They'll say you've got fleas. It's just like, what the fuck, what point are you trying to make? It's so interesting, because if you replace trans people with black people, or like gay people or something, all of a sudden J.K. Rowling would probably take the exact opposite point of view. Imagine an alternative version of this where it's actually like about, I don't know, like the civil rights movement or something. Imagine saying, but accusations of racism have been sufficient to intimidate many people. Institutions and organisations I once admired who are cowering before the tactics of the playground. They'll call us racist. They'll say I hate black people. What next? They'll say you've got fleas? Speaking as a white woman, a lot of people in positions of power really need to grow a pair and say the N-word or whatever. Look, you get the point. Without an example, I can only assume that all this means is people who want to say transphobic stuff just can't anymore. There's the weird bit about speaking as a biological woman, because again, it implies that trans women aren't women. Although, to be fair, the phrase biological woman means fuck all. Like, biological in what way? Chromosomes? Intersex people, mate. Genitals? Intersex people, mate. Hormones? Trans people, mate. Again, it's like, it's the fucking point. Like, oh. How can someone this smart, who wrote so many great children's books that are beloved by so many, be so fucking stupid? Anyway, moving on. The part I find interesting, specifically, is, again, I'm not sure what this clownfish, actually, you know what? I'm just gonna Google it. Clownfish transgender, there you go. What's that? Okay, so right, so they're sequential hermaphrodites. Okay, so clownfish can change sexes. That's interesting, but I don't see what the relevance is. I'll do some reading on that later, because I quite like fish. Aquariums are like one of my favourite places to be. Anyway, this isn't the point. So I don't know what she's talking about with the clownfish thing. Whatever. Like, sure. The interesting part is that, according to the people who argue that clownfish prove that humans aren't a dimorphic species. Humans aren't a dimorphic species, J.K. Rowling. I don't know how to tell you this, but you've mentioned them already, and I've made a whole video about them, but let's acknowledge intersex people. Because guess what? We can't be dimorphic if there's more than two types of people. You fucking idiot. And in case you're unaware, I just googled dimorphic and it comes up with the definition, which is occurring in or representing two distinct forms. You're arguing for a sex binary that doesn't exist, J.K. Rowling, you fucking moron. You can't acknowledge intersex people and then pretend they don't exist later on in the same fucking essay, you dickhead. Okay, but this is all build up, so now we're going to get the actual arguments here. So why is she doing this? Why is she speaking up? Why not quietly do her research, which she's obviously not doing well because she's completely ignoring the scientific consensus, and keep her head down? So here we are. So she's worried about the new trans activism for these 5 reasons. So first of all, so she has a charitable trust that focuses on alleviating social deprivation in Scotland, with a particular emphasis on women and children. Now, I've talked about billionaires and charity before, and I've talked about J.K. Rowling and charity specifically before as well, so I won't really go into it, but let's be honest here, J.K. Rowling could give away 99% of her money tomorrow and still be more rich than most people, but she won't. She does charity partly to offset costs and partly as a PR stunt, because if she really cared, as I would, if I was a billionaire, I would give away 99% of my wealth and still have £10 million left over to live for the rest of my life, which, by the way, is 10 times the amount of money someone on minimum wage will earn in their entire life. But that's just a whole thing. I'm not going to go into that. So here's the thing. So the Trust supports projects for female prisoners and for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. And it also funds medical research into MS, a disease that behaves very differently in men and women. I don't see the point here. Like, does she think that trans men are just going to lie to their doctor and say that they're cis men? Like, a lot of the time we talk about trans issues and we talk about how a lot of these things should just be between a patient and a doctor, and this is one of those things. Like, trans men still go to the gynecologist. This is a health thing. This isn't a gender thing. Besides, I know Scotland is slightly different from England, but as far as I'm aware, your doctor will know whether you're cis or trans because it will be on your medical records. I don't know. I don't know what sort of point she's trying to make here. So she's saying that it's likely to have a significant impact on many of the causes she supports. So the MS bit is obviously bullshit, but I see. Oh, okay. Oh, so she's just making the gender essentialist point that Ariel Scarcilla likes to make. So basically she's arguing that trans women shouldn't be in female prisons. She thinks that all people who are assigned male at birth are abusive or in some way threatening to women, even though trans people are overwhelmingly the victims of abuse, very rarely the perpetrators of it. Trans women are victims of horrendous abuse in male prisons. Cis women are not on the receiving end of horrendous abuse from trans women in women's prisons. If J.K. Rowling had actually done any fucking research into this at all, she would be aware of this. Likewise with the survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, trans women are overwhelmingly likely to be victims of those crimes. If she's trying to argue that we shouldn't let trans women into, for example, homeless shelters or domestic violence women's shelters, for example, the only argument she could possibly be making there is that she believes that trans women are likely to be abusive, like attack vulnerable people. I mean, I suppose you could argue that maybe these people who are traumatized by a relationship with a man might see a trans woman and think that they're a man and be triggered, but at the same time, you could say that about trans men. Does she think that trans men shouldn't be allowed in women's shelters? What about if they pass? Is it only a non-passing trans people? What about people who are abused by other women? What about lesbians who are victims of domestic abuse? Do they not? What's the solution there? J.K. Rowling has no answers to these questions. Finally, we have the pushing to erode the legal definition of sex and replace it with gender. Like, I've never heard this. And also, who gives a shit? Well, I actually don't know what point she's trying to make here. So, erode the legal definition of sex. Why is that bad? Like, genuinely, I have no idea what point she's trying to make here. Hang on, let's have a look. I'm just going to Google legal definition of sex. Yeah, it doesn't seem to mean anything here. The only thing I've got here is that in the past, the legal definition of sex prevented cis women from serving in government, which I'm fairly sure is a bad thing. We should probably abolish that. And then there's... we've got this one. In the human species, the male is called man and the female woman. Some human beings whose sexual organs are somewhat imperfect have acquired the name of hermaphrodite. Again, I don't know, what's that supposed to fucking mean? Doesn't mean anything. Why should we protect that? I don't know. See, this is the thing. If she elaborated on what she means instead of just peddling vagaries, it would be helpful because we could actually have the conversation. But it seems that she doesn't want to have the conversation. She just wants to sort of vaguely gesture towards the idea of a conversation. But again, I don't think anyone on the left is really arguing that sex and gender are the same thing. We agree that they're different. That's like the point. If anything, it's TERFs and those on the right who would argue that actually sex and gender are the same thing. We're the ones who are saying that we should separate them and that trans people are valid and etc, etc. I don't know what the point she's trying to make here is. Again, we have these deep concerns about the effect the trans rights movement is having on education and safeguarding. So, again, there's no examples given, but extrapolating, I suppose the safeguarding bit is rather concerning because it does sort of imply that she thinks that trans people are inherently violent or abusive or likely to harm others or something. Again, if that's not the case, I'm more than happy to accept that maybe that's not what she meant, but it certainly does seem that way. Likewise, with the education part, what are the concerns there? Like that people learn that trans people exist? Does she think that schools are trying to push children into being trans? That certainly doesn't happen. You can't say you have deep concerns about safeguarding in education if you don't say what those concerns are, because that fucking means nothing. Like, I mean, I have deep concerns about people who like ginger nuts. I have deep concerns, very deep concerns about those people. I'm not going to say what they are, but I have deep concerns about them, especially when it comes to education and safeguarding. See, I'm the founder of a children's charity, and I have very deep concerns about people who like ginger nuts being around children. There's certainly an implication that's being made there, isn't there, J.K. Rowling? But you're not going to come out and say it, just like you're too fucking cowardly to come out and say that Dumbledore is a gay man in the text of your movies. And then there's the whole thing about freedom of speech. Yeah, okay, we get the argument. You're making the exact same fucking argument as the Nazis now. Richard Spencer's of the world. Charlottesville was a free speech rally, all that kind of shit. Okay, yeah, free speech, whatever, piss off. Oh, but you're more than happy to try and control the speech of people who are criticising you on the internet, but I guess their free speech doesn't count. And then we get into the detransitioner movement. Okay, so, first off, this isn't a thing. Or at least it is a thing, but it's very, 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 very rare. I'll flash some statistics up on screen now. I believe it's around like 0.3% of trans people who are already 1% of the population, so it's infinitesimal. And a lot of the time, according to, I believe, Stonewall, actually, you know what, I'm just going to look it up. Here we go. So Stonewall has an article on its website called Dispelling Myths Around Detransition. And in fact, on that article, they do cite, they say that actually what we know from the research is that those acknowledgements of regret are actually most often related to unsatisfactory surgical results. We also can't forget that gender identity services in Britain are hugely under-supported and under-resourced. Waiting times for appointments at these clinics can be up to 2 years, and patients can be forced to travel hundreds of miles to be seen. The lack of funding to ensure trans young people and those who may be questioning their gender are given the high-quality care and support. We need to understand and respect that the reasons why someone detransitions are often complex and nuanced, contrary to what some in the media and online might say. The most common reason for detransition is the person couldn't cope with the family and community support they lost and the experiences of transphobia, where others may detransition because they were unable to find a job or housing. Furthermore, J.K. Rowling did above in this essay say that sex is immutable and can't change, and yet she describes detransitioning as returning to their original sex, implying that they did change their sex? I don't know, that doesn't really make any sense to me. Again, some say they decided to transition after realising they were same-sex attracted, and that transition was partly driven by homophobia, either in society or their families. Like, okay, I understand that, and that does suck, but those are very, very small amount of people, and they deserve love and support. But that doesn't mean that all trans people or all trans kids are invalid or in some way just confused gay people. Then there's this whole bit about how many people of different sexes decide to transition, and like, okay, like it has absolutely no bearing on anything really, and it's really confusing as well because she says that because she uses the words male and female when like that can refer to trans people in their correct gender, but I think she's using it in their gender assigned at birth, even though it doesn't. Anyway, so she complains that more trans men are transitioning. Like, alright, piss off. The weird part that I really don't like, though, is the part where she says autistic girls, read trans men, are hugely overrepresented. Now, I'm not sure why she's pointing this out, and I'm not autistic. I think, well, I'm on the spectrum. I've got a condition called dyslexia. It has a lot in common with autism, but it's not autism, basically. So I don't really think that it's my place to talk for autistic people. However, I'm not sure what point she's trying to make by saying that autistic girls are hugely overrepresented. Like, is she saying that autistic people don't have the right or don't have the capacity to understand that they're trans? Is she saying that people are forcing autistic people to transition? It very much seems like she's trying to invalidate autistic trans people in a very ableist way by using their autism against them. I don't know. It's very, very strange to me. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm certainly not happy about it. It seems very much to me like the time Michael Knowles. Remember Michael Knowles? We covered him in the PragerU video I made a few weeks ago. When he got banned from Fox News from disparaging Greta Thunberg by using her disability and saying that she has no idea what she's talking about and she's being controlled by her parents because she's autistic and a 16-year-old autistic girl has no autonomy. It feels very much like that. Then she goes on to cite Lisa Lippman, and honestly, I mean, does she expect anyone to take her seriously after that? Like, if you Google Lisa Lippman, there's a whole section on her Wikipedia page called Correction that outlines what happened there. So essentially, and it does cite some studies, so I will put those in the description, but it does state that there was a self-selection bias of the subjects that were surveyed because Lippman only surveyed the parents and not the trans people themselves, nor the health professionals caring for them in the study, causing the journal to retract it and re-edit it, with Lippman herself saying the post-publication review identified issues that needed to be addressed to ensure the article meets the publication criteria. Given the nature of the issues in this case, the editors decided to republish the article, replacing the original version of record with a revised version in which the author has updated the title, abstract, introduction, discussion and conclusion sections to address the concerns raised in the editorial reassessment. The materials and methods section was updated to include new information and more detailed descriptions about recruitment sites and to remove 2 figures due to copyright restrictions. Other than the addition of a few missing values in Table 13, the results section is unchanged in the updated version of the article. And the editor wrote that the corrected article now provides a better context of the work as a report of parental observations, but not a clinically validated phenomenon. So, nice one. Just cite a dodgy source there. Par for the course at this point. I'm just going to skip the rest of it because it blames fucking Tumblr and Reddit for people's gender transition. So then Rowling tries to deal with the regarded fact that refusing to allow trans people to transition does and will result in suicides, in deaths, in self-harm, in a lot of harmful mental health issues. This is extremely well documented and well studied. Rowling just cites one psychiatrist who disagrees, though. Fine, whatever. See, this is a classic anti-science tactic. What they'll do is they'll cite one person who agrees with them, but discount the entire scientific community when they disagree with them. Like, there's not much I can say about that part, to be honest with you. It's just denial of science, and like, what's the point in arguing against that? But oh, it gets worse. Then we get this really uncomfortable... Okay, it's just transphobic. At this point, J.K. Rowling actually argues that trans men are likely just women who wanted to escape the hardships of being a woman. This part really, really fucking pisses me off. Now, okay, look, I have plenty of disagreements with J.K. Rowling. I don't fucking like the woman, but I think this is possibly the worst part. She genuinely, apparently doesn't like it when people call her a transphobe or call her a TERF, and yet without a hint of irony, she will say, oh, actually, trans men are likely just mentally ill women. Like, this is literally what this whole section of the article is about. She even says... Well, she even does the Ariel Scarcella thing, where she says if she'd been born 30 years later, she might have tried to transition as well. The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. Like, what does she think womanhood is? Does she think that trans men have easier lot in life than cis women? Is she... Oh my god, is she... Oh, I'm losing my fucking mind. I've been recording this for like an hour now. J.K. Rowling, how are you this fucking stupid? How can you believe this toxic... nonsense. Oh, I'm fucking moulding now. She discusses trans men's accounts of gender dysphoria as essentially the same thing as her struggling with her mental health as a teenager. She believes that if she'd have gone on Tumblr in the 80s, or I don't know how fucking old she is, whenever she was a kid, that she would have been persuaded to be trans because of her mental health issues. This part is actually just disgusting. She quotes Simone de Beauvoir. She says it's perfectly natural for the future woman to feel indignant and at the limitations posed on her by her sex. The real question is not why she should reject them. The problem is rather to understand why she accepts them. And then says that because she didn't have a realistic possibility of transitioning in the 80s, rather than transitioning, she just read books and listened to music that helped her with her mental health issues and the issues she had with her body. I actually can't understand how anyone can claim not to be transphobic or to care deeply about trans people and trans issues when they could write something like this without any irony, perfectly clearly just saying that she thinks that trans men are confused women, and that if she was able to transition when she was younger, she would have transitioned. Like, for a start, I think she could. I'm not entirely certain about that. But regardless, even if that's not the case, I mean, obviously she'd be able to socially transition, but this isn't an argument, well, this isn't an argument, but it's not an argument against trans people being valid, it's just an argument that nowadays it's easier and better for trans people to be able to live authentically and live their lives as they see fit. It's strange because TERFs always seem to think that trans activists are constantly pushing for cis people to be forced to be trans, but what we actually want is for trans people to be accepted and not die. That's literally our only goal here. Like, there's nothing sinister, it's nothing like that, it's just, this is wild. So then she slips into sort of true scummy area and says that transition will be a solution for some gender dysphoric people, and then she quotes the research that states that between 60 and 90% of gender dysphoric teens will grow out of their dysphoria. Again, this is worthless because no one is saying that children should medically transition. All that happens is they get put on puberty blockers, and if they decide that actually actually know the gender they were assigned at birth is their correct gender, they'll just come off the puberty blockers and nothing bad will happen, it'll be fine. Then she goes off on some circumstantial evidence of she knows one trans woman. Like, okay. Like, sure, whatever. Like, I'm not transphobic, I have a trans friend. Like, she's actually making that argument, which is, fuck me. Okay. But she says that being older, she went through a long and rigorous process of evaluation, psychotherapy, and staged transformation. This clearly shows that she doesn't know anything about trans people, because that's how it works. Like, no children are being forced to medically transition. No one's performing surgeries on people unless they're absolutely 100% sure that that's what they want and what they need. They have psychological evaluations. They have so many hoops they need to jump through. I know trans people who are complaining about how many hoops they have to jump through because they have to basically lie to the doctors in order to get them to believe that they are genuinely trans. Especially non-binary people who basically have to pretend to be binary trans people in order to get them to believe them. If anything, there's too many obstacles in the way of trans people actually being able to transition. But again, even with that said, I, and certainly no one that I know, is urging for a removal of almost all the robust systems through which candidates for sex reassignment were once required to pass at all. In order to get gender confirmation surgery, you have to jump through a lot of hoops, and some of those hoops are necessary because we do want to make sure that everyone who transitions does want that. But then she tries to conflate it with the gender recognition certificate, which is really, really weird because that's nothing to do with gender confirmation surgery. It's not. That's a social thing, and all it does is just allow you to change your gender on official documents. I genuinely have absolutely no idea what negative influence this will have on society, but apparently J.K. Rowling doesn't either, because she doesn't cite any examples. She just says, oh my god, a man can get a gender recognition certificate and say that he's a woman, okay? And, like, even if some cis men decided to do that, I don't know, like, as a laugh or whatever, like, what does that do? What effect does that have? It doesn't affect anything. It doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Like, legally being recognised as a woman, I as far as I know, doesn't have any repercussions at all. Or at least no negative ones. Oh my god. Okay, so in this part, she tries to equivocate Donald Trump and his sexual assault accusations, incels, and people who think that people shouldn't be transphobic and that TERFs aren't a positive thing in society. One of these things is not like the other. Like, genuinely, how can you actually believe that, for example, me saying TERFs, fuck off, learn about trans issues, stop ignorantly attacking trans people for no reason, and Donald Trump apparently sexually assaulting multiple women? Like, how can you possibly think that those two are in any way connected? Or comparable, rather. And incels, people saying, hey, maybe don't be dicks to trans people, are the same as incels. The funny thing is that Donald Trump and incels would probably mostly agree with J.K. Rowling on trans people, because they're also virulently hateful people. Everywhere women are being told to shut up and sit down or else is an interesting turn of phrase, because that's what she's telling trans people to do. Sorry, but criticism is not silencing. I don't want J.K. Rowling to sit down, shut up, and whatever, but, like, maybe if she stopped talking about trans people, like, that would be good, because she's apparently not very good at it, and she knows fuck all about it, but she has a platform, and just like Graham Linehan, she's more than happy to just constantly attack vulnerable people, which is apparently what we're doing to her, which is ironic. So again, one tactic she's been using throughout this is conflating two completely different things in order to try and paint trans activists as idiots who would believe these two are the same thing. Like, for example, she's read all the arguments about femaleness not residing in the sexed body, whatever the fuck that means, and also the assertions that biological women don't have common experiences. I don't think anyone is arguing that people who are assigned female at birth don't have common experiences, but that doesn't mean that trans men are women. And it doesn't mean that just because we agree that so-called biological women may have some common experiences, that we also then disagree that femaleness resides in the sexed body, because that doesn't mean, well, for a start, that's a really weird way of putting it. But for another thing, once again, J.K. Rowling doesn't really elaborate. So, for example, trans women have breasts, intersex people can have any kind of chromosomes, any kind of genitals, but she calls us deeply misogynistic and regressive, whilst reducing women entirely to their body and their biology, which seems quite misogynistic to me. And is she trying to argue that gender is biological? Because earlier on, she complained about women who didn't fit in with the social idea of what a woman should be, but now she's arguing that femininity is inherent, is biological? See, that's the thing, is she talks about the cruelly segregationist idea of women having their own biological realities, or unifying realities that make them a cohesive political class. I mean, okay, so for a start, this is not exclusive, is the point. Trans people who are on hormones can have many of the same biological realities as the gender they're transitioning into, and they can lose a lot of the biological similarities they had with the gender they were assigned at birth. Furthermore, again, intersex people throw a wrench into the works here, because where do they fall in this dichotomy? It's what is the biological reality of being a woman? So we know that she thinks that periods are the biological reality of being a woman, even though a lot of women don't have periods. And again, she just sets up a straw man here. So no one, as far as I'm aware, no one believes that there is no material difference between trans women and cis women. What we're saying is that trans women and cis women both fall under the category of woman. It's like saying, people are saying there's no difference between black women and white women. Like, yeah, obviously there is, but they're both still women. This weirdly reminds me of the race science of the Victorian era, where people would believe that black people were some kind of inferior race. Because, what are you saying, there's no difference between a white man and a black man? No, like, that's not the point. So then she just reels out the turf talking points. Woman is not a costume, woman is not an idea in a man's head. Oh, I wonder where I've heard that before, actually. Yeah, woman is not a pink brain, a liking for Jimmy Choos or any of the other sexist ideas, now somehow touted as progressive. But she just argued that she's read the arguments about femaleness not residing in the sexed body, and now she's saying that gender roles and gender stereotypes are. So she got really mad about people saying that maybe gender is just learned. But then she's just saying woman is not a pink brain, a liking for Jimmy Choos or any of the sexist ideas now somehow touted as progressive. Again, I don't know what that means. I have no idea. I don't know, it just seems like a contradiction. And here we get to the point that she made in her tweet. So the inclusive language that calls female people menstruators and people with vulvas strikes many women as dehumanizing and demeaning. You know what else is dehumanizing and demeaning, J.K. Rowling? Transphobia, you cunt. But the thing is that she can't really complain about this because she did the same shit. This whole reducing people to their genitals is what she did to trans people earlier. She constantly goes on about the importance of sex. She was mentioning all the weird stuff about genitals and trying to defend Magdalene Burns. And you can't reduce women down to their biological essentials and say, this is a woman. A woman is a woman if she has, I don't know, like XX chromosomes and a vagina. One, because that's not true. Two, because there's a lot of exceptions to that. And three, because you can't then complain about other people doing that. Like, you don't get to sexualize and to demean and to attack trans people's bodies and decisions to do with their bodies and then also say, well, actually, gender is just a social construct. You don't get to say that after you've just said that femaleness resides in the sexed body, unless you mean something else by femaleness other than gender. Well, what does femaleness mean in that case? If you're just talking about what makes a woman, then we have some very clear definitions. Like, that's what this whole argument is about. There's no arguing with it, really. And also, of course, she says woman is not an idea in a man's head, which I would say definitely implies that to J.K. Rowling, trans women are not women. Which, it's not a surprise, but why is she pretending not to be a transphobe? And again, I'm not sure what this whole thing is. So for those of us who have had degrading slurs battered at us by violent men, it's not neutral, it's hostile and alienating. Like, I'm just lost. I don't know what she's trying to say. Either she's a hypocrite or a moron. I'm not entirely sure which. And also, I hate to break it to you, J.K. Rowling, but trans people have degrading slurs spat at them by violent people, often men, on a very regular basis. So then we have the revelation about, J.K. Rowling being a domestic abuse and sexual assault survivor, which I'm not really going to touch on much because obviously it's, to be honest, I'm not really sure why she brought it up unless it was to accuse trans women of being violent men or something. Hang on. I see. Okay, so the whole point of it is basically to use her trauma to victimize trans people. See, it's interesting because she says she doesn't want to garner sympathy with it, which, you know, fine, yeah. But out of solidarity with the huge numbers of women who have histories like mine who've been slurred as bigots for having concerns about single-sex spaces. First off, what are your concerns? Secondly, What about the trans people who've gone through similar situations? What about the trans women who've gone through similar situations? Are trans men allowed in your single-sex spaces? And if so, why? And also, cis women and trans men are completely able to commit violent acts against one another, just like trans women are more likely to be the victims of domestic abuse or sexual assault than be the perpetrators of one. So I don't understand what the logic is behind this idea of excluding them, unless it's just bigotry. So here's the thing, when she says that she has solidarity and kinship for trans women who suffer at the hands of violent men, it rings hollow because she doesn't seem to want to help those people. She doesn't seem to want to extend a hand. She doesn't seem to have the empathy to understand that trans women who are the victims of violence are in the same boat as cis women who are the victims of violence. And she says that the majority of trans people pose zero threat to others, which, yes, but then why did you spend the entirety of the first, 2/3 of this essay demonizing trans people, implying that they shouldn't be allowed in female prisons or female-only spaces? But no, they pose zero threat, but I still don't think they should be allowed around children. Fuck off. Fuck the fuck off. And here's the thing. So she's gone mask off a few, basically throughout this, but this is the point where she basically just says it outright. Trans people need and deserve protection. Like women, they're most likely to be killed by sexual partners. Like women. Not as women. Not because they're women. Like women. Yeah, trans women have similar struggles to cis women, but they're not women though, right, JK? And then she tries to pair it up with trans women who work in the sex industry, particularly trans women of colour, are at particular risk, but they're all at risk. Why have you brought this up? This is the point of intersectionality. So people of colour, trans people, and sex workers are all at risk. Someone who is all three of those is incredibly at risk. But it's very, very interesting to me that she brings up that trans people pose no threat, but that those most at threat are people who work in the sex industry and who are black. I don't know, I suppose to me it sort of implies that J.K. Rowling is making a sort of swerve argument here, because she's basically immediately saying that the main reasons trans people, or trans women especially, receive violence is because of their sex work or because of their race, not because they're trans. Because then, if she did that, she might have to acknowledge her part in it. I don't know, it's kind of disgusting really that she implies this. I'm not comfortable with it. And here we go. So, J.K. Rowling says she wants trans women to be safe, no mention of trans men. However, she doesn't want to make natal girls and women less safe. And what might make them less safe, I wonder? Well, when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, and as I've said, gender confirmation certificates may now be granted without any need for surgery or hormones, then you open the door to any and all men who may wish to come inside. That is the truth. So, I know J.K. Rowling is just ridiculously rich, so it's probably been a while since she's interacted with the plebs and used a public toilet or changing room, but as someone who is quite poor, allow me to enlighten you, J.K. Rowling. So, when us normal people, us peasants, us plebs, when we go for a slash, when we go for a dump, when we relieve ourselves, there is not a bouncer on the door. There is not someone checking our genitals. There is not someone demanding gender recognition certificates if someone doesn't look cis enough. There is no one stopping us going into the changing room or the bathroom or whatever. If it's a nightclub, there's a guy there who'll probably try and sell you a squirt of cologne. But if it's in a shopping centre or something, I don't get what your point is. I am a very male-looking man. A very fat male-looking man, thanks to lockdown. But I'm a male-looking man. I have a big beard. I'm probably not going to be seen as a trans woman or as female in any way. There is nothing stopping me just going into the women's bathroom, just as I am. Furthermore, if you're implying that people are just going to go into the bathroom and abuse people, that's already illegal. Do you seriously think that, say if I was going to abuse someone in the toilet, or in the changing room or whatever, the fact that I might be arrested for being in the wrong toilet when I'm already risking jail time and all kinds of shit by abusing people? Because it's like the argument for the death penalty. When you shoot someone, you may as well just shoot a bunch of people because you're going to die anyway. If I'm going to go in and I'm going to abuse someone, why would I give a shit about the relatively minor crime of going into the wrong fucking bathroom? But yes, basically this is J.K. Rowling's veiled excuse for victimizing trans people and non-passing cis people, is to create a climate of fear in which people will look at trans people and mistrust them. Is to create the implication that trans women are just going to go and abuse people in the toilets, and for some reason thinks that this will cause cis men to do it as well, even though that was already a thing, but whatever. So again here, J.K. Rowling claims that reading about the Scottish government proceeding with the gender recognition plan clans, which means that, see, I don't like this, because all a man needs to become a woman, in quotations, is to say he's one. Like, okay, most of the people who are doing this, well, almost all the people who are doing this are trans, and again, I really don't see, like, what difference being legally a woman will make. But then she says that, like, ground down by the relentless attacks from trans activists on social media, when I was only there to give children feedback about pictures they'd drawn for my book under lockdown. You tweeted some transphobic shit and people called you out for it. A lot of people were probably very abusive, and yeah, I condemn those people, obviously. But then she says that she was triggered. This is the thing, she says she's triggered as if she says it's a contemporary word, but it's literally the correct terminology to refer to a PTSD recurrence or flashback. She genuinely seems to think that cis men pretend to be women in order to assault people. Does she not think that already happens? And legally being a woman doesn't mean that assaulting women is now legal or easier? I don't understand, like, what point she's trying to make. So she claims that she spoke up about the importance of sex, and, like, there's only one reason you would do that, and that's to claim that sex is gender, or that there's no difference between sex and gender, which is clearly not the case. Okay, so here's the tweet. So what she said is, if sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth. But that's not true. Like I genuinely, I spend a lot of time, basically all my time, in very, very far left-wing spaces, and I can tell you for a fact, no one on the left is saying that sex isn't real. No one is saying that same-sex attraction is in some way transphobic. But what is transphobic, I would say, is saying that the lived reality of women is erased by saying that sex isn't real, although no one has said that sex isn't real, because that implies that you think that trans men are women and trans women are men. And that is transphobic, unequivocally. Like, you complain about being transphobic, but you are a transphobic. And again, you know, probably don't call people a cunt or a bitch online, maybe. She is a TERF. J.K. Rowling, you are a TERF. That is what the term means. You TERFs invented it for yourselves. Don't lie. You are a TERF. You deserve cancelling. Yes, I would agree with that. Cancel J.K. Rowling. Fuck her. Punching and death. No, I'd say not. No, don't punch or kill J.K. Rowling. I don't think anyone was actually going to. You are Voldemort, said one person, clearly feeling this was the only language I'd understand. I mean, I can see where that person was coming from. I can. I understand. I think that's a very, very liberal thing to do because they're incapable of reading another book. But you are the villain here. You're the one who's attained all the power and is using it to victimize, bully, and abuse those without. You are causing deaths. You do think of yourself as superior to those you dislike. Actually, maybe you're more Grindelwald than Voldemort. I don't know, whatever. Then she does some more self-aggrandizing and self-pitying. Basically says, I could just say the approved things, but I believe in free speech. I don't believe in scooping up the woke cookies and basking in a virtue-signaling afterglow. Honestly, this sort of rhetoric is the same rhetoric that people on the far right like to use. It's the same shit. Then she finishes off with a quote, without a doubt it's more comfortable to endure blind bondage than to work for one's liberation. The dead too are better suited to the earth than the living. Implying that bigotry is in some way breaking the chains and working for one's liberation. But trans activists are definitely not doing that. They're what was it? They're enduring blind bondage. But no, activism is for losers. Again, huge numbers of women are justifiably terrified by the trans activists. Give examples. I don't know of any trans activists who have actually caused any severe harm. I feel like I would have heard about it more. But you know what? I know a lot of TERFs who've caused a lot of damage. Interesting that. Then she's doing the noble hero thing. She refuses to bow down to a movement that she believes is doing demonstrable harm and seeking to erode woman as a political and biological class, and offering cover to predators like few before it. So, okay, first of all, like, fuck off with your self-pitying bullshit, but beyond that, bowing down to a movement that you believe is doing demonstrable harm and seeking to erode woman as a political and biological class. What does that mean? Like, genuinely, what does that mean? No one is saying, we're not eroding woman as a class. We're expanding it. That's all we're doing. We're adding trans women to the woman umbrella. That's literally all that's changing. Furthermore, what about intersex people? Can they not call themselves women? What about people who are completely, as J.K. Rowling would put it, biologically female, apart from the fact that they have XY chromosomes, or XXY? Do they not deserve to be called women? It just makes no sense. And then the disgusting bigotry and saying offering cover to predators like few before. In what way? Genuinely, in what way? Because the only way you could believe that is if you actually believe that trans people are predators. Do you believe that? Well, you're not going to outright come out and say it, are you? Because you're a fucking coward. She then tries to mitigate it by saying, I stand alongside the brave women and men, gay, straight and trans, who are standing up for freedom of speech and thought and the rights and safety of some of the most vulnerable in our society. Trans people are some of the most vulnerable in our society, but you don't seem to give a shit about them, J.K. Rowling. Furthermore, the fact that you have some friends who are gay or trans or whatever who also hate trans people means fuck all. Yes, Blair White exists. Yes, Magdalene Burns existed. So fucking what? They're not indicative of a majority of people. They're not a trend. So here's the thing. What threat do trans people pose to young gay kids? What threat do trans people pose to fragile teenagers? What threat do trans people pose on women who are reliant on and wish to retain their single-sex spaces? No, genuinely, unless you're suggesting that trans people or trans activists are forcing children to transition, are preying on children, and are likely to attack vulnerable people in domestic violence shelters, I don't know what the point of this is. And here's the worst part. Well, not the worst part, but here's a bad part. Polls show that those women are in the vast majority and exclude only those privileged or lucky enough never to have come up against male violence or sexual assault and who have never troubled to educate themselves on how prevalent it is. Which is directly saying that she thinks that trans women are predators, are violent, and are dangerous. That's the only reason that one would say something like this. And that the only people who disagree, who think that maybe trans women, who are also overwhelmingly the victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, should be allowed in these spaces. The only people who believe that are privileged or lucky enough never to have come up against male violence or sexual assault and who've never troubled to educate themselves on how prevalent it is. I mean, again, this implies that not only trans women, but all men are inherently violent or like a ticking time bomb. It's disgusting. And then she concludes by basically just playing defense and saying, I'm not hateful, I just hate trans people. Or rather, she says, I don't hate trans people, I'm just concerned about the plight of trans youth. Fuck off. If you actually cared about trans youth, you would let them transition. You would stop putting so much pressure on them to conform to your idea of what they should be. You should support them. You should stop saying, children don't know what they're fucking talking about, autistic people don't know what they're fucking talking about, all trans women are predators or violent, or trans men are just ridiculous, stupid women who don't understand, who are just mentally ill in some way. Don't you fucking dare say that you don't hate trans women after this tirade of shit. Fuck you. Fuck you. And again, she says the supreme irony is that the attempt to silence women with the word TERF may have pushed more young women towards radical feminism than the movement seen in decades. For a start, again, radical feminism does not necessarily mean being a TERF or SWERF. I'm a radical feminist. Radical feminism just means vehemently and passionately believing in women's rights and in equality of the genders. It doesn't mean anything like what she's claiming it does, but even so, no one's trying to silence you with the word TERF. We're accurately applying a term that you invented for yourself to you. And also, if the only thing that was standing between you and a hateful, bigoted ideology is people on the internet being mean or criticizing you for your bigotry, there was not much stopping you in the first place, was there? And here she's trying to say that she doesn't want us to pity her, which is fine. Okay, that's... I haven't really gone into the sexual assault thing because I didn't think it was really relevant. She's a survivor, not a victim. She only mentioned her past because, like every other human being on the planet, I have a complex backstory, which is a weird way of putting it, which shapes my fears, interests, and opinions. Here's the thing. I understand that past trauma or past, anything that happened in the past can cause someone to be bigoted or to have certain ideas or fears or, as she says, fears, interests, and opinions. That's an explanation. It's not an excuse. Being abused in the past doesn't make it okay for you to then be abusive to other people. Okay, that's it. This was probably a really long one. I made a lot of pauses, but so I don't know how long it'll end up being, but if it ends up being 20 minutes, I'm going to be really pissed off because I spent ages doing this.
Fuck turds, don't have sex with them.
J.K. Rowling is a TERF. Fuck J.K. Rowling. I hate J.K. Rowling. She's a dickhead. The thing is, throughout all of this, She's basically just regurgitated all the TERF talking points that we've become accustomed to. So like saying there are concerns without saying what the concerns are, basically saying trans women are all predators, or that trans men are all confused women, or that trans activists are trying to force people into transitioning. And it's just absurd and offensive and untrue, and I don't understand why or how you could come to this conclusion, and it's incredibly disappointing. Not surprising, because as I've covered before, Harry Potter, now you look back on it with retrospect, has a lot of really fucked up stuff in it. J.K. Rowling has been assumed to be a TERF for a very long time, and now she's just gone mask off and admitted to it, I guess. And I don't want to make a big thing about it, which is why I made this unscripted. I'm not really trying to make a grand point about it or anything, but I think it's important to discuss that this rhetoric is dangerous. It does cause people to feel unsafe. It does contribute to the normalizing of abuse, of bigotry, of harmful ideas. Of abuse. And it's honestly disgusting how often TERFs will hide behind marginalised groups and people. Graham Linehan is very famous for this, hiding behind lesbians. But it's frankly despicable for someone like J.K. Rowling to use her platform to delegitimise and dehumanise vulnerable people, and it's disgusting to me. This is probably the last time I'll talk about J.K. Rowling. I wasn't going to talk about J.K. Rowling at all. When she made her original tweets, I thought, fuck it. You know, it's not worth my time. Like, I've already spoken a lot about J.K. Rowling, but I saw #IStandWithJKR trending on Twitter recently, and I thought, you know what, I need to talk about this. Because a lot of people do agree with her. A lot of people find her words very compelling and very, very persuasive. And I think that's dangerous, because they shouldn't be. Comparatively, they make no real sense. It's sad when someone you looked up to turns out to be such a piece of shit. I understand why people were so mad at ContraPoints. I do. This is just a tangent now. I should have really made this a live stream. I've been thinking of getting into streams, but I understand why people did that, because someone they looked up to, they felt let them down. And I think I feel the same way about J.K. Rowling, because Harry Potter was such a big part of my childhood. I remember when the last book came out, I read it all in one day, I sat there and I read it from start to finish. It's a long fucking book. And it's just so upsetting to have this, not only this part of my life, but this massive part of British culture I don't know, it's just difficult. It's upsetting. Fuck J.K. Rowling. Fuck TERFs. Fuck SWERFs. And no matter how well written bigotry is, it's still bigotry, and it's still disgusting. I'm not going to burn my books, because I don't believe in burning books. But there's a reason, there's many reasons, one of which is quality. There's a reason that I decided a long time ago that Terry Pratchett was my favourite author, not J.K. Rowling.
Oh dear, I seem to have spotted a cunt. Good day.